Okay, so what if I told you that a kind of strange series of experiments with rats way back in the 70s actually holds the key to understanding one of the biggest crises we're facing right now? We're going to dive into this because the story we're about to unpack, well, it might just change everything you think you know about addiction.
You know, for decades, we've all been told this one story about addiction. It's a chemical hook, right? Or it's a brain disease, or maybe even a moral failing. But what if that entire story is missing the single most important piece of the puzzle?
All right, so our story really starts with this groundbreaking experiment from the late 1970s. It was called Rat Park. And believe me, it completely set the stage for a new way of looking at this whole problem.
Okay, so the setup for this thing was just brilliant and how simple it was. The researcher, Bruce K. Alexander, he basically created two totally different worlds for his rats. On one side, you've got your standard lab cage. You know the type. Small, isolated, super lonely. But on the other side, he built what he called Rat Park. And this place was a paradise for rats. We're talking a huge 95-square-foot space filled with sawdust, toys, and the most important thing of all, other rats to play with, mate with, and just be social with.
So in both of these worlds, the lonely cage and the rat paradise, the rats had the exact same choice. They had two water bottles. One was just plain old tap water. The other, it was water laced with morphine. The question was pretty simple. Which one are they going to drink?
Now, this wasn't some casual experiment. It was super rigorous, and it unfolded in 4 phases. First, the rats just got introduced to the choice. But then, they were forced to drink the morphine water to make them physically dependent. After that, they were taught that the morphine would relieve their withdrawal symptoms. And finally, after a break, the drug was brought back to see if they'd relapse. I mean, think about that. They were essentially engineering addiction.
So after all that, after forcing dependence on them, what do you think happened? Well, this quote from Dr. Lloyd Cederer just nails the astonishing result. It turns out it wasn't about the power of the drug. It was all about the cage. And in a follow-up experiment, the results were, honestly, they were staggering. Get this, the isolated male rats, the ones stuck all alone in those tiny cages, they drank 16 times more morphine than the guys living it up in Rat Park. 16 times more.
And it wasn't just the guys either. The isolated females drank 5 times more of the drugged water than the females in Rat Park. The conclusion was just inescapable. It was the environment, the community. That was the deciding factor.
Okay, so this is where the story takes a huge leap, from a lab in the 1970s right into our lives today. Because this experiment, it has some seriously startling things to say about what's happening to people right now.
And look, I get it. It's easy to dismiss this, right? Come on, they're just rats. But what happens when we start looking at our own society through the same lens? What happens when we are the ones being put into cages? There's this term coined by economists Ann Case and Angus Deaton that describes a really terrifying trend. They call it deaths of despair. What they found was a shocking spike in the number of Americans dying from suicide, drug overdose, and alcoholism. And they argue these 3 things are all deeply, deeply connected.
And we're not talking about some small statistical blip here. This wave of despair is so huge that it's actually dragged down the overall U.S. life expectancy for 3 years in a row. You have to go all the way back to the First World War and the Spanish flu pandemic to see anything like that. It's that serious.
So, the question is, who is being hit the hardest by this? Well, the data shows this really stark, growing divide. If you look at middle-aged white Americans with a 4-year college degree, their mortality rates are pretty low and stable. But for those without a degree, the rates have been absolutely skyrocketing.
And this quote, it just gets to the very heart of what all this data is telling us. This isn't just about economics or not having enough money. It's about the total collapse of a way of life. It's about losing the very things that give life meaning: dignity, pride, and self-respect.
Okay, so let's connect the dots here. What on earth does a lonely rat in a cage have to do with this massive human tragedy? Well, as it turns out, pretty much everything.
I want you to just think for a second about the conditions in that solitary cage. We're talking total isolation, mind-numbing boredom, no purpose, no social bonds, no chance to just play. It's a perfect recipe for despair, right?
Okay, now look at the conditions that are driving these deaths of despair in people.
the end of stable, meaningful work, communities and social ties that are just falling apart, broken families, a deep loss of meaning and purpose. Does any of that sound familiar? It's the human equivalent of that lonely rat's cage.
And this just forces us to ask a really radical question. For so long, we've just assumed the opposite of addiction is sobriety. But what if we've been wrong this whole time? What if the true opposite of addiction isn't sobriety at all, but connection?
So this all brings us to a new, and I think much more complete, story of addiction. It's one that really respects the complexity of human life and moves way beyond those simple one-size-fits-all answers.
It's a framework called the Biopsychosocial model. And the idea is pretty straightforward. To really understand addiction, you have to look at the whole picture. You can't just look at the drug or just at the brain. You have to look at the person and the world they live in.
So this model basically breaks it down into 3 interacting pillars. First, you've got your biological factors, think genetics, brain chemistry. Second, you've got psychological factors, your thoughts, your feelings, any trauma you've experienced. And third, and this is crucial, you have the social factors, your relationships, your community, your entire environment.
Let's make this a little more concrete. So, a biological factor? That could be a genetic predisposition to addiction. A psychological one? Maybe you're dealing with chronic pain or some serious mental distress. And a social factor? That could be anything from losing your job, to being totally isolated, to living in a community that feels like it's falling apart. You can see how all these things can come together to create a perfect storm.
And all of this leads to a pretty profound conclusion. Addiction is not a moral failing. It's not just a brain disease. So often, it's a predictable, complex, and deeply human response to an environment that's become unbearable. In a way, it's an adaptation to living in a cage.
Which leaves us with one final, and I think absolutely vital question. If the Rat Park experiments were right, and if this whole epidemic of despair is teaching us that same powerful lesson, if isolation is the disease, then could it be that community is the cure?